The morning sun peeked through the clouds as Margaret Johnson walked up the long driveway of the Thompson mansion, her sensible shoes crunching against the gravel. At 45, she carried herself with quiet confidence, earned from 2 decades of working in other people's homes. Her neat uniform was pressed to perfection, and her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a tidy bun. This would be just another job, she told herself, smoothing down her apron one last time before ringing the doorbell. The chime echoed through the enormous house, and Margaret could hear slow, heavy footsteps approaching the door. The man who opened it was tall and lean, with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to cut right through her. Richard Thompson, aged 68, stood in his expensive bathrobe, looking down at Margaret as if she were something unpleasant he found on the bottom of his shoe. "You're 2 minutes late," he said sharply, checking his golden wristwatch. "I specifically said 8 a.m. Margaret kept her voice steady and professional. "I apologize, sir. There was a bit of traffic on Cedar Street due to road work." She held out her folder of references from previous employers, all praising her work ethic and attention to detail. Richard barely glanced at the papers. "Just don't let it happen again. Come in and wipe your feet properly. That rug costs more than you make in a year." As Margaret followed him inside, she couldn't help but notice the beautiful home around her. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and artwork on every wall. But something felt missing. There were no family photos, no signs of life or laughter. The house felt as cold as its owner. "The cleaning supplies are in here," Richard said, opening a closet door. "I expect everything to be spotless. I'll be checking your work regularly, and I have security cameras throughout the house, so don't even think about touching anything valuable." Margaret's heart sank a little, but she kept her head high. She'd dealt with difficult employers before, but something about Richard's tone made her skin crawl. Still, she thought about her 3 children at home, especially her youngest, who dreamed of going to college to become a doctor. This job paid better than most, and she couldn't afford to let pride stand in the way of her children's future. "I understand completely, Mr. Thompson," she replied calmly. "Would you like me to start with the living room or the kitchen?" "Kitchen first," he snapped. "And don't move anything on the counters. My wife—" He stopped suddenly, his face tightening. "Just don't move anything without asking me first." As Richard walked away, Margaret noticed his shoulders slump slightly. Through the window, she caught sight of a neglected garden, the roses struggling to bloom among the weeds. Something told her there was more to this bitter man than met the eye. She pulled on her cleaning gloves and took a deep breath. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered to herself, a habit she developed over years of facing life's challenges. Then she grabbed her supplies and headed to the kitchen, determined to prove her worth through her work, even if her new employer seemed determined to see the worst in her. Little did she know that this job would test not just her patience and professionalism, but also her capacity for compassion in ways she never could have imagined. And for Richard Thompson, this day marked the beginning of a journey that would force him to confront the person he'd become, though neither of them could have guessed how that transformation would come about. The next few weeks proved harder than Margaret had imagined. Every morning, she'd arrive at the Thompson mansion exactly 5 minutes early, yet somehow Richard would still find something to complain about. He'd follow her from room to room, his expensive slippers shuffling against the hardwood floors, watching her every move like a hawk. "You missed a spot," he'd say, pointing to imaginary dust. Or, "That's not how you polish silver." Even though Margaret had been polishing silver since before he probably bought his first piece. One particularly trying morning, Margaret was carefully dusting the collection of antique vases in the living room. Her movements were precise and gentle. She'd handled precious things all her life. But Richard's voice cut through the quiet like a knife. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked from his armchair, not even looking up from his newspaper. "Those vases are worth more than you could ever dream of." Margaret's hands trembled slightly, but she kept working. She thought about her daughter's recent letter from college. She'd made the dean's list again. That pride helped wash away the sting of Richard's words. Later that same day, while Margaret was organizing the kitchen pantry, she heard Richard talking loudly on the phone in the next room. "Can you believe they sent me a colored maid?" he was saying to someone. "Had to hide my wife's jewelry. You can never be too careful these days." Margaret closed her eyes and counted to 10, just like her grandmother had taught her. The same grandmother who'd worked as a maid herself, who'd told her to hold her head high no matter what. "Your dignity isn't theirs to take," she'd say. The situation reached its peak when Richard misplaced his favorite watch. He stormed into the kitchen where Margaret was preparing his lunch. Another task she'd taken on without being asked. "Where is it?" he demanded, his face red with anger. "My gold watch. The one my wife gave me. I left it on my bedside table." Margaret kept her voice steady. "Sir, I haven't touched any of your personal belongings. Have you checked your bathroom? Sometimes you leave it there after your morning shower." Richard's face twisted with suspicion, but he marched off to check anyway. 10 minutes later, he returned, the watch on his wrist, but no apology on his lips. Through it all, Margaret noticed things about the house, about Richard. The way he'd stare at his wife's photo when he thought no one was looking. How he'd sometimes forget to eat unless Margaret left a plate in front of him. The medicine bottles in his cabinet that grew in number each week. One evening, as Margaret was finishing up, she found a small photo album that had slipped behind a bookshelf. As she carefully pulled it out to replace it, it fell open. There was Richard, decades younger, smiling broadly at a civil rights rally. His arm was around a beautiful woman, his wife, Margaret Guest, and they were both holding signs calling for equality and justice. Margaret quietly put the album back. She thought about how life can change people, how loss can twist a person's heart until they become unrecognizable even to themselves. She thought about her own losses, her husband 5 years ago, her mother last spring, and how she'd chosen to let those sorrows soften rather than harden her. As she gathered her things to leave, she heard Richard in his study, talking to himself again. But this time, his voice wasn't angry. It was broken, lonely. "I miss you so much, Helen," he whispered to the empty room. Margaret pulled on her coat and headed home, her mind already on tomorrow. Despite everything, she'd be back. Not just for her children's future, but because sometimes, she believed, people needed kindness most when they deserved it least. Little did she know that tomorrow would change everything, in ways neither of them could possibly expect. The evening of Richard's dinner party started like any other, with Margaret working quietly in the kitchen preparing everything to perfection. She'd stayed late to help, even though it wasn't part of her regular duties. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh-baked rolls filled the air as she heard the first guests arriving. 10 people from Richard's country club showed up, all dressed in expensive clothes that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly salary. She could hear their loud laughter and conversation floating in from the dining room as she put the finishing touches on the appetizers. Everything must be perfect. Richard had insisted earlier, pacing around the kitchen. These are very important people. The way he'd said it, it made it clear that, in his mind, Margaret wasn't. As she carried out the first course, one of the guests, a kind-looking elderly woman, smiled at her. "The food smells wonderful, dear," she said. But Richard quickly cut in. "Let's not distract the help," he said sharply. "They tend to get confused easily." A few of his friends chuckled, while others looked uncomfortable, studying their wine glasses. Margaret kept her face neutral as she served each plate, just as she'd done for 20 years. But inside, her heart was pounding. She thought about her own dinner table at home, where everyone who sat there was treated with respect, no matter what job they did or what color their skin was. The real trouble started when one of the guests spilled red wine on Richard's white tablecloth. Margaret rushed over with a clean napkin and club soda, something she'd learned years ago was the best way to treat wine stains. "Don't touch that," Richard snapped, loud enough to make everyone jump. "I don't want you ruining it more than it already is. Who knows where those hands have been?" The room fell silent. Margaret stood frozen, the napkin still in her hand. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with embarrassment, and a few with the same prejudice she saw in Richard's face. "I was just trying to help, Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Well, don't," he replied coldly. "Just stick to the kitchen where you belong. That's what we pay you for, isn't it?" Margaret straightened her back and walked to the kitchen, her shoes clicking against the hardwood floor in the dead silence. Behind her, she could hear someone say, "Really, Richard, that wasn't necessary." In the kitchen, Margaret leaned against the counter and took deep breaths. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from her sister. "Coming over for Sunday dinner," it read. Margaret almost smiled, thinking about her family's warm kitchen, filled with love and laughter. Her hands shook as she typed back, "Need to talk. Having a rough day." While the dinner party continued in the other room, Margaret called her sister during her break. She stepped out onto the back porch, where the evening air was cool and quiet. "I can't take it anymore," Margaret whispered into the phone, trying to keep her voice down. "The things he says, the way he looks at me. I know the pay is good, but my soul is tired." Her sister was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Remember what Mom used to say? Sometimes the hardest people to love are the ones who need it most." She learned that from Grandma, who worked for people just like him. "But Mama and Grandma didn't have to put up with this kind of treatment," Margaret protested. "No, they had it worse," her sister replied gently. "And they stayed strong, not just for the money, but because they believed in being better than the hatred they faced. They changed hearts by showing kindness even when it wasn't deserved." Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek, looking up at the stars. She thought about all the women in her family who'd walked this path before her, holding their heads high through far worse than she'd face tonight. "Maybe you're right," she said finally, "but something's got to change. I can't keep." She stopped as she heard a crash from inside the house. Then someone shouted, "Richard? Richard, are you all right?" Margaret's heart jumped. Despite everything that had happened that evening, she found herself running back into the house, not knowing that she was about to face a moment that would change both their lives forever. The next morning, after the disaster of the dinner party, Margaret almost didn't come to work. But something pushed her forward, maybe curiosity, maybe hope. The house was quieter than usual when she arrived, with Richard nowhere to be seen. She started her usual routine, dusting the living room before moving to the study. The door was slightly open, and she could hear Richard on the phone, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "No, I don't need you to come over," he was saying. "I'm fine. Yes, I took my medicine." He sounded tired, almost vulnerable. Margaret began cleaning the hallway, giving him privacy. But as she worked, her eyes caught something interesting. A cardboard box had fallen from the top shelf of the hallway closet, spilling old photographs across the floor. As she knelt to gather them up, one photo made her pause. It showed a younger Richard, probably in his 30s, standing proudly next to his wife at what looked like a civil rights march. They were holding hands and smiling, their free hands raising signs that read "Equal Rights Now" and "Love Knows No Color." Margaret's hands trembled as she picked up another photo. This one showed Richard and his wife at what looked like a community center, serving food to people of all races. His wife's smile was radiant, and Richard's face showed nothing but joy and purpose. More photos told the story. Richard and his wife at voter registration drives, at integration rallies, even at what looked like a mixed-race church service. In every picture, they looked happy, committed, full of hope for a better world. "What are you doing?" Margaret jumped. Richard stood in the hallway, looking at the scattered photos. But instead of anger, his face showed something else. Pain, maybe even shame. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," Margaret said quickly. "The box fell, and I was just—" "That's Helen," he said quietly, picking up one of the photos. "My wife." His fingers traced her face in the picture. She believed in making the world better, fighting for what was right. For the first time, Margaret saw tears in his eyes. "She sounds like a wonderful person," she said gently. Richard sank down into a nearby chair, still holding the photo. "She was. She made me better, too. We met at a protest rally, you know. Both got arrested that day." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She used to say that love was the only force strong enough to change hearts." "What happened?" Margaret asked softly, before she could stop herself. Richard's face darkened. "Cancer. 5 years ago. It was quick, too quick. One day she was here, planning our next volunteer project. And then," he shook his head. "After she died, I couldn't bear to look at these photos anymore. Couldn't bear to remember who I used to be, who we were together." Margaret thought about her own losses, how grief can twist a person inside out. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "when we lose someone we love, it's easier to be angry at the world than to feel a pain." Richard looked at her sharply, but there was no hatred in his eyes now. For a moment, she saw a glimpse of the man in those old photos. The man who had fought for equality, who had believed in justice and kindness. "Helen would be so ashamed of me now," he whispered, more to himself than to Margaret. "The way I've been acting, the things I've said." Margaret stood up, gathering the remaining photos. "It's never too late to honor her memory," she said quietly, "to be the person she loved again." Richard nodded slowly, still staring at the photo in his hands. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the tears on his cheeks. For a moment, the room was perfectly quiet. Then Richard clutched his chest suddenly, his face contorting in pain. The photo slipped from his fingers as he gasped for breath. Margaret's heart leaped into her throat as she realized this was no ordinary moment of grief. "Mr. Thompson," she said urgently, moving toward him. "Mr. Thompson." But Richard couldn't answer. His face had gone pale, and his left arm was shaking. As he slumped in his chair, Margaret knew that everything was about to change. Time seemed to freeze as Margaret watched Richard slump further in his chair. His face had turned a frightening shade of gray, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. All the months of tension and hurt between them vanished in that instant. She saw only a human being in desperate need of help. "Mr. Thompson," she called again, rushing to his side. Drawing from the first aid training she'd taken years ago when her husband had heart problems, she quickly assessed the situation. The signs were clear. He was having a heart attack. With one hand, she pulled out her phone to dial 911. With the other, she loosened his tie and helped him into a more comfortable position. "Stay with me," she said firmly, her voice calm despite the fear gripping her heart. "I'm getting help." The 911 operator's voice crackled through the phone. "Emergency services, what's your location?" Margaret spoke clearly, giving the address while keeping her eyes fixed on Richard. "Suspected heart attack, male, 68 years old. He's conscious, but in severe pain. Help is on the way," the operator assured her. "Can you stay on the line?" Richard's eyes were wide with fear as he tried to speak. My medicine," he managed to gasp. "In the kitchen." Margaret remembered seeing his heart medication on the kitchen counter that morning. "I'll get it," she told him. "Just hold on." She ran to the kitchen, her shoes echoing through the quiet house. The pill bottle sat next to the coffee maker. Grabbing it and a glass of water, she rushed back to Richard's side. "Here," she said, helping him take the medicine. "The ambulance is coming. Just breathe with me, okay? Nice and slow." Richard's hand found hers and gripped it tightly. The same hands he'd been so suspicious of just yesterday were now his lifeline. Margaret could feel him trembling. "I'm scared," he whispered, and in that moment, he wasn't the harsh man who'd belittled her for months. He was just a frightened human being facing his own mortality. "I know," Margaret said softly, squeezing his hand. "But I'm right here with you. We're going to get through this together." She started humming quietly, the same hymn she'd sung to her husband during his illness. Richard's grip on her hand tightened, but his breathing seemed to steady a little. The wail of sirens grew closer. Margaret had left the front door unlocked, and soon she could hear the paramedics rushing in. They moved with practiced efficiency, asking questions and hooking up equipment. "Good thing you were here," one paramedic said to Margaret as they prepared to move Richard onto the stretcher. "Your quick response probably saved his life." Richard's eyes found Margaret's as they lifted him. The fear was still there, but something else too. Recognition, perhaps even shame. "Don't," he started to say. "Don't worry about anything," Margaret cut in gently. "I'll lock up the house and make sure everything's safe." But Richard shook his head weakly. "Don't leave," he whispered. "Please." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. After everything he'd said and done, here he was, asking for her help. And despite it all, she knew she couldn't refuse. "I'll follow you to the hospital," she said. "Just focus on staying strong." As the paramedics wheeled him out, Margaret quickly gathered his wallet, phone, and a light jacket. She watched the ambulance pull away, its sirens cutting through the peaceful morning air. Standing in the driveway, she took a deep breath and pulled out her phone to call her family. They needed to know she wouldn't be home for dinner tonight. As she waited for someone to answer, she looked back at the big house, thinking about the photos scattered in the hallway, about the man Richard used to be, and about how sometimes it takes a crisis to break down the walls we build around our hearts. The line connected, and her sister's voice came through. "Everything okay?" "No," Margaret replied, getting into her car. "But maybe, just maybe, it will be." The hospital waiting room buzzed with quiet activity as Margaret sat, her hands clasped in her lap. She'd been there for 3 hours, watching doctors and nurses hurry past. The same cleaning lady had mopped the floor twice, giving Margaret a small nod of recognition each time. One worker to another. Her phone had buzzed several times with messages from her children asking where she was. She'd explained briefly, and her oldest had texted back, "After how he treated you. Mom, you're too good sometimes." Maybe she was, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Finally, a doctor appeared in the doorway. "Are you here for Mr. Thompson?" she asked, looking at her clipboard. Margaret stood up, smoothing her wrinkled uniform. "Yes, I'm his—" She paused, realizing she didn't know how to describe their relationship. "I'm his housekeeper. I was there when it happened." The doctor's face softened. "You're the one who gave him his medication and called 911. Well, I can tell you right now, your quick thinking saved his life. Another 10 minutes without help, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Relief flitted through Margaret's body, making her legs feel weak. She sank back into her chair. "He's going to be okay. He's stable now. The heart attack was serious, but we were able to treat it in time. He'll need surgery tomorrow, and then several weeks of recovery." The doctor hesitated. "He's been asking for you." Margaret followed the doctor through the maze of hospital corridors. The smell of disinfectant reminded her of the long hours she'd spent here with her husband during his final days. But this time was different. This time, there was hope. They found Richard propped up in bed, looking smaller somehow without his expensive clothes and stern expression. Tubes and wires connected him to various machines that beeped steadily. When he saw Margaret, his eyes filled with tears. "You stayed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret moved closer to his bed. "Of course I stayed." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. heavy with the weight of all the cruel words and suspicious looks he'd given her over the past months. "Because that's what decent people do," Margaret replied simply. "They help others in need, no matter what." Richard's hand trembled as he reached for hers. This time, there was no hesitation about touching her dark skin. "The paramedics told me. They said if you hadn't been there." His voice broke. "Don't think about that now," Margaret said gently. "You need to focus on getting better." "No, I need to say this," Richard insisted, his voice growing stronger. "When I was lying there, thinking I might die, all I could see was Helen's face. How disappointed she'd be in what I've become." He took a shaky breath. "And then I saw you, helping me despite everything. Just like she would have done." A nurse came in to check his vitals, working quietly around them. When she left, Richard continued, "I found that old photo album last week, the one you saw today. I've been looking at it every night, remembering who I used to be. Then the heart attack happened, and," he squeezed her hand, "sometimes God sends angels wearing cleaning uniforms." Margaret felt tears in her own eyes. "I'm no angel, Mr. Thompson. Just someone who believes in basic human kindness." "Richard," he corrected. "Please call me Richard." He leaned back against his pillows, suddenly looking tired. Would you stay a little longer? I don't want to be alone right now." Margaret pulled her chair closer to his bed. "I'll stay as long as you need." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the hospital window, they sat together in comfortable silence. The steady beeping of the heart monitor became a quiet reminder of how quickly life could change, how walls built over years could crumble in moments, and how the simple act of showing kindness could begin to heal wounds far older than either of them realized. The days following Richard's surgery passed slowly. Margaret had taken time off from her other cleaning jobs to help with his recovery, something that surprised even her children. "People can change," she told them over dinner one evening. "Sometimes they just need a reason to remember who they really are." On Richard's first day back home, the big house felt different. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been shuttered for years, and the silence felt peaceful rather than oppressive. Margaret had spent the previous day preparing everything: cleaning, organizing his medications, and making sure the kitchen was stocked with healthy food. "You don't have to do all this," Richard said as she helped him settle into his favorite chair. His voice was stronger now, but his body still moved carefully, like he was afraid it might betray him again. "I know," Margaret replied, adjusting his pillows. "But I want to." As she worked around the house that morning, Richard watched her with new eyes. Every now and then, he'd start to say something, then stop himself. Finally, after she brought him his heart-healthy lunch, he found his voice. "I've been thinking a lot in the hospital," he began, pushing his soup around with his spoon. "About Helen, about who I was when she was alive, about who I became after." He looked up at Margaret, his eyes clear and direct. "I owe you an apology, not just for one thing, but for everything." Margaret sat down in the chair across from him, sensing he needed to say more. "After Helen died, I was so angry. At God, at the world, at everyone who still had what I'd lost. I started seeing enemies everywhere." His voice cracked. "I forgot everything we fought for together, everything we believed in. I became exactly the kind of person we used to protest against." He reached for a photo frame on the side table, one of the pictures from that scattered box, now properly displayed. It showed him and Helen at the voter registration drive, their faces young and full of purpose. "The day of my heart attack, when I was lying there thinking I might die, I wasn't scared of death. I was scared of facing Helen, of having to explain what I'd become." His hands trembled slightly as he set the photo down. "But then there you were, helping me, caring for me, even after how terribly I treated you, just like she would have done." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she let him continue. "You know what I thought about in the hospital? All those times I followed you around, checking your work, making those horrible comments. You never once lost your dignity. You showed me more kindness in one moment than I'd shown you in months." He pulled an envelope from beside his chair. "I want to make it right. I've written letters to everyone who was at that dinner party, telling them how ashamed I am of my behavior. And I've made some calls. There's a community center downtown that Helen and I used to volunteer at. They're still running, still doing good work. I'd like to start helping them again, if you'll help me get back on my feet." Margaret smiled gently. "Of course I will." "And there's something else," Richard added, his voice softer now. "In the hospital, I updated my will. When I'm gone, I want half of everything to go to a scholarship fund for housekeepers' children who want to go to college. Helen would have liked that." Margaret couldn't stop the tears now. She thought about her own children, about all the other hardworking people she knew whose kids dreamed of education they couldn't afford. "Helen always said that change starts in our own hearts," Richard continued, reaching for Margaret's hand. "It just took me almost dying to remember that." He squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for not giving up on me." The afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. In that moment, Margaret could almost feel Helen's presence, not as a ghost, but as a reminder that love and kindness could break through even the hardest shells we build around our hearts. 2 months after the heart attack, Richard's house had become a different place entirely. The drawn curtains were now always open, letting in natural light. Fresh flowers, Margaret's touch, brightened every room. But the biggest change wasn't in the house itself, but in the people within it. One sunny morning, Margaret arrived to find Richard already up, dressed, and sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out before him. His recovery had been steady, and his face had regained its color, though his hair had grown a bit longer and softer around his face. "Good morning," he called out cheerfully. "Come look at these plans for the community center." Margaret set down her bag and joined him at the table. The papers showed renovation designs for the downtown center where he and Helen had once volunteered. "They need updates to make it more accessible," Richard explained, pointing to the drawings. "New ramps, wider doorways, that sort of thing." "That's wonderful," Margaret said, noting how his eyes lit up as he talked about the project. "And that's not all," he continued, pulling out another stack of papers. "Remember those letters I wrote to my dinner party guests? Well, 3 of them have agreed to join the center's board of directors, and they're bringing their checkbooks with them." Margaret smiled, remembering how different things had been just 2 months ago. As she started her morning routine, Richard followed her around the house, not to criticize this time, but to keep talking about his plans. "The scholarship fund is set up too," he said, watching as she watered the plants. "The lawyers finalized everything yesterday. It'll help at least 10 students a year." He paused. "I hope your youngest will apply when she's ready for college." Margaret turned to him, touched. "That's very kind of you." "It's not kindness," Richard said firmly. "It's justice. It's doing what's right. It's what Helen and I believed in before I lost my way." Just then, the doorbell rang. Richard went to answer it, and Margaret heard familiar voices in the hallway. It was some of his old friends from the civil rights days, people he'd reconnected with recently. They'd been coming by more often, helping him remember who he used to be. Come in," Richard called out. "Margaret, would you join us? We're planning a fundraiser for the center." Margaret walked into the living room where everyone was settling in. She noticed how naturally Richard introduced her, not as the help or my housekeeper, but simply as Margaret, a dear friend who saved my life. The group spent the morning discussing plans for the community center. Margaret listened as she worked, adding her thoughts when asked. She couldn't help but notice how Richard looked to her for approval now, valuing her opinion in a way that would have been unthinkable months ago. During a break in the conversation, one of the visitors, an elderly gentleman, pulled Margaret aside. "You know," he said quietly, "I knew Richard and Helen back in the day. What happened to him after she died, it broke all our hearts. But now—" He glanced at Richard, who was laughing at something someone had said. "Now I see the old Richard again. Helen would be so proud." Later, as the visitors were leaving, Richard caught Margaret's arm gently. "Would you and your family join me for dinner this Sunday?" he asked. "I'd love to meet them properly. And maybe you could teach me how to make that sweet potato pie you mentioned." Helen used to love sweet potato pie. Margaret saw the hopeful look in his eyes, the look of a man who had found his way back to himself. "We'd be honored," she said. As she watched him wave goodbye to his friends, Margaret thought about how life's hardest moments sometimes led to the most beautiful changes. The bitter man who had once followed her around with suspicion was gone, replaced by someone who reminded her more and more of the young idealist in those old photographs. "You know what Helen always used to say," Richard said, turning back to her with a gentle smile. "She said that love is like a mirror. It shows us who we really are, both the good and the bad. But it's never too late to change what we see in that reflection." 1 year after the heart attack that changed everything, Richard's house was filled with the sounds of laughter and music. It was Sunday evening, and the weekly dinner tradition that had started months ago was in full swing. Margaret's family and Richard had grown close, turning these gatherings into something they all looked forward to. In the kitchen, Margaret and her youngest daughter were putting the finishing touches on dinner while Richard sat at the counter, carefully following their instructions for making his first ever sweet potato pie. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but his smile was bright and genuine. "No, not that much cinnamon," Margaret's daughter laughed, reaching over to guide his hand. "You want people to taste the sweet potatoes too." "Your mother's been trying to teach me for months," Richard chuckled. "I'm a slow learner, but I'm getting there." The house that had once felt like a museum now felt like a home. Photos of Helen still held places of honor on the walls, but they were joined by new ones. Pictures from the community center's reopening, snapshots from family dinners, and a particularly special photo of Richard standing proudly next to Margaret's daughter at her college acceptance ceremony. "Did I tell you?" Richard said, wiping his hands on his apron. The scholarship fund helped 15 students this year instead of 10. The community really stepped up with donations. Margaret smiled, remembering how far they'd come. These days, Richard spent most of his time at the community center, working alongside people he would have once crossed the street to avoid. He'd become known as the elderly gentleman who always had time to listen to people's stories and help where he could. The doorbell rang, and Margaret's older children arrived with their families. Behind them came some of Richard's old friends from his activist days, who'd become regular guests at these gatherings. The house quickly filled with the chaos of children running around and adults catching up. As they all settled around the large dining table, which had been expanded to accommodate their growing Sunday family, Richard stood up, tapping his glass gently. "Before we eat," he said, his voice strong and clear, "I want to say something." He looked around the table, taking in all the faces, black and white, young and old, all brought together by an unexpected twist of fate. 1 year ago, I was a different man. A man lost in bitterness and fear, who'd forgotten everything that really mattered. His eyes met Margaret's across the table. But sometimes God sends us angels disguised as housekeepers. Gentle laughter rippled around the table. "When I had that heart attack, I thought it was the end. Instead, it was a beginning. Margaret didn't just save my life that day. She helped me find my way back to who I really am. Who Helen always knew I could be." He reached for a small wrapped package beside his plate. "Which is why I wanted to do something special today. Margaret, this is for you." Margaret opened the package with trembling hands. Inside was a key and a legal document. "I've transferred ownership of this house to your name," Richard said quietly. Now, don't protest," he added as Margaret started to object. I'm not going anywhere. You can't get rid of me that easily. But I want to make sure that after I'm gone, this place continues to be what it's become. A home where everyone is welcome, where love wins over hate, where second chances are possible. Tears flowed freely around the table now, but they were happy tears. Margaret's youngest daughter started playing the piano in the corner, a skill she was learning thanks to the music program at the community center. The sweet potato pie might have been a little heavy on the cinnamon, but nobody seemed to mind. Later that evening, as the sun set and cast a golden glow through the windows, Richard sat in his favorite chair, watching Margaret's grandchildren play on the floor. On the wall above them hung a new photo, one taken at last week's community center fundraiser. In it, Richard and Margaret stood side by side, both laughing at something off camera. You know what Helen would say about all this? Richard mused softly. Margaret, arranging flowers in a nearby vase, smiled. What's that? She'd say love always finds a way to heal what hate breaks. Sometimes it just takes a heart attack and a very patient housekeeper to remind us of that truth. The room filled with the sounds of family, of love, of life being lived fully and well. And somewhere, they both knew, Helen was smiling.